Thank you for inviting me here. I just want to send you greetings on behalf of the Diocese of the Rocky Mountains and also Wellspring Church. They know that I'm here with you guys, and there's some people that are praying. So thank you. We planted Wellspring Church about 16 years ago, and ever since then it's been a significant. There's been times of ups and there's been times of downs. I tell you, one of the things that I have just been that I found respite in is the family that the Lord has given me. I have a wonderful wife. She's named Jana, and I have 6 great kids. And one of the things I love to do in Colorado is fly fish. So that's one of the passions that I have. And so I'm just, even as I was coming out here, I was just kind of reflecting back on all the things that God has done through the church and through the family, and I'm just deeply grateful. The other thing that I was thinking about is I was driving from Midland, Texas to San Angelo on that road. I was thinking about, when was the last time I was in Texas? And it occurred to me, the last time I was driving through Texas, I got a speeding ticket. And I was going from Mexico. We had a mission trip, and we were going from Mexico back into Colorado. And I thought to myself, well, I hope I don't get another one. So that's my last memory of Texas. So I don't know. That's a confession.
You must be going really fast.
Because they don't hand out very many speeding tickets? No. So I guess that's a confession to my bishops here. So you receive my forgiveness. But I'm honored to be here. It's great to be here with you guys. Bishop Mark has asked me to talk about a few things. The first is kind of Wellspring's story, and also some of the principles that we learned as a result of planting the church. So I want to give you some of those, and maybe we will even have some time to interact and engage and see how maybe some of these principles that I give to you, how they may apply to your context, and maybe also have some question and answer time around that. But I do just want to give you a little bit of our story. And again, if there's some questions that you have, Mark, during that time that you sent me, you can interject. And then the second section, I want to give to you maybe some nuggets, nuts and bolts and nuts, things to do, next steps for if you want to engage in church planting for your diocese. So the first section, I just want to give you a little bit of a snapshot of Wellspring Church and how we got to where we are. We planted the church in 2001. And we had about 15 people in my backyard, and we didn't know what we were doing. And I'll tell you this, probably the number one principle that we learned about what it takes to plant a successful church is to have a successful launch team. Because the people that were around me would tell you this, that I broke every rule in the book. I did everything wrong in regards to church planting. There's no reason why Wellspring Church should be alive today, except for the fact that we had a launch team that was deeply committed to the work of church planting. And all of the people that went with me, every one of those have stayed faithful, except there's one couple that has left on not the best of terms, but every one of those couples, people that were a part of that community, had stayed with us through thick and thin. I would say that's the number one contributing factor of why we saw success in church planting. But back in 2001, we had about 15 people in my backyard. We began to dream as we were going through the book of Acts of what it would look like to plant a gospel community in a gospel-deficient neighborhood. And we were looking at, okay, so we wanted it to be gospel-grounded, we wanted it to be liturgical, and we also wanted it to be spirit-driven. So as we were looking at those 3 avenues, we at that point didn't really have a platform because there really wasn't an Anglican expression that allowed for those 3 streams. And maybe as some of you guys know that at that point the Anglican mission came about, we kind of hitched our wagon to that. But we started with 15 people, and then we moved into a fellowship hall of another church. We grew from 15 to 25, so that was exponential growth in biblical proportions. And then from that fellowship hall, we moved to another fellowship hall, and we were there for about 6 years, and we saw growth from about 25 people all the way up to about 150. And we just saw the Lord move in pretty significant ways. And then in 2007, we bought our current facility, and we jumped up from then till now to close to about 500. We planted a number of different churches. And as we've just been reflecting, even on that journey that God has had us on, the one principle that I would say is this, of why we have seen some growth within our church. And it came as an epiphany just recently. Our staff team of about 15 people went to the Global Leadership Summit at a large church in our area called Cherry Hills. And a guy by the name of Andy Stanley was talking. He shared a principle about how his church had grown so large. And he used the phrase, uniquely better. And that phrase grabbed a hold of me. And while I wouldn't use that phrase for our church, we came back as a staff and we said, why was that resonating so deeply? And we felt like there was some aspect of that little principle that was true of us. Because as people come into the door of Wellspring, what they'll say is there's not really a church in Denver like this, in the Denver metro area. And a lot of the growth that we've experienced, I'll share this in just a little bit, most, if not all of our congregation does not come from a liturgical or an Anglican or an Episcopal background. Most all of our congregation does not. And they will say this, they'll say, I don't know how to explain your church, but there's this Catholic thing going on, this like historic thing. You preach from the Word, and there's a lot of life happening. And so they may not use Spirit, Word, Sacrament, but in their own words, they're saying Spirit, Word, Sacrament. And so what we've said from the get-go is this is the identity of what we want to be, and we want to continue to always be incessantly tweaking so as to make it better. And so we're as we look at Spirit, Word, Sacrament, we're not going for perfection, but we're saying, God, this is what you've invited us into. This is the identity that you've given us. And it fulfills a niche in the Denver metro area. In fact, I could look at all the different, even the three other churches that we planted, they're strong in the Word, they're strong in the Sacrament, but I would say that in terms of Spirit, the expression of the Holy Spirit at Wellspring Inglewood gets expressed a little bit differently than the church plants that we've launched out. So there's just a uniqueness about it. And I'm not saying one of a kind, not at all. I'm just saying that there's a uniqueness about it. There's a niche. And so as a result, people from around the Denver metro, if they're looking for something that's a little bit different, they'll find their way there. And what our team does is that we're just incessantly tweaking. How can we be more faithful to the identity that God has given us? Spirit, Word, Sacrament. That's our identity. So that would be the first principle, is that we're unique and we're always trying to improve. And that's just been a core value, but it's also been a core behavior, which is translated into a particular kind of culture at the church. The second principle that I think that has been important for us as a community, just as we've seen some growth happen, is I feel like the leadership, as well the board, the vestry, as well as the staff, they live the vision. They try in all of their ways to live the vision. I think that's an important principle. And one of the things that we've heard from people is that what we see on Sunday morning, what we see through the life groups, what we see in mission, is also being expressed in your life. And we can't underestimate the power of an incarnated vision. It's extremely powerful. In fact, I was talking to a guy by the name of Marshall Shelley. He used to lead up Leadership Journal, which is a subsidiary of Christianity Today. And Marshall Shelley had interviewed some of the best leaders in this country. He interviewed Garrison Keillor. He interviewed Bill Hybels. So business leaders, church leaders, culture leaders. And I asked Marshall, I said, so Marshall, out of all the different people that you've interviewed, what is the leadership characteristic or quality that sticks out to you the most? Because there's a lot of books written about leadership. What is the thing that you think is the most significant in regards to leadership for people within the church? And he said, hands down, the most significant characteristic, I thought he was going to say entrepreneurship, somebody who casts vision well, somebody who's able to develop strategies, somebody who's able to see the big picture and become like a vision architect. I thought somebody who's like wildly gifted in communication. He didn't say any of those things. He said the number one leadership quality is the most effective in all of the leaders that I've interviewed is the strongest leader lives the vision. No matter what size church we are, whether we're 10, whether we're 50, whether we're 5,000, the most significant thing that we can do as leaders is be the vision that God has called us to be. Not just to say it out there, but to actually live it in here. So that would be the second principle. Unique and always improving. And then secondly, be the vision. Okay. Now, Mark asked me to talk a little bit about worship and the worship at Wellspring. As I alluded to before, we have probably about 95% of our congregation comes from either non-denominational or, well, I would just say 5% come from Episcopal or Anglican backgrounds. The rest of them have come from a slew of other denominations or no denominations or no Christian background. And one of the things that we really try to do in regards to our worship is to be hospitable, liturgically speaking. So that means typically we're not very high church. Now, it's not because we're against high church. High church is beautiful. But the thing that we try to emphasize is to figure out ways to be hospitable so as the new person comes in, that they're able to have accessibility into at least a few aspects of the worship service. So we don't want to saddle the service down with so many different things that people aren't able to understand or engage in. So we always try to have like liturgical highlights, kingdom moments, that highlight a particular aspect of the liturgy that reflects a particular aspect of the gospel. So that when they say, oh, now I understand why we're doing what we're doing, they're able to engage and really truly feel like it's the worship of the people. So I think that that's something else that's been pretty strategic. I wouldn't say that we're liturgical light. It's just that we really try to be intentional with the liturgy that we're using. So unique, always improving, be the vision, hospitable in regards to our liturgy. The other thing I want to mention is mission. And here's another principle, especially as it applies to church planting. And this phrase is not original with me. Originally I got it from Ed Stetzer, and I think it's true. In fact, it's been true of Wellspring, is that in planting a church, we evangelize over administrating until we have to administrate to evangelize. Let me say that again, then I'll unpack it. We evangelize over administrate. Over. In other words, the priority is over the administration until we have to administrate to evangelize. Now, for people that maybe have come from an Episcopal church or a very church-centric, and I believe we have to be worship-centric, absolutely. But I think the tendency, the temptation, at least it is for me, is to focus all of our time on the Sunday morning. And in planting a church, the emphasis has to be always on worship, but in terms of administration, evangelism over administration until we have to administrate to evangelize. Okay, so this is what I mean. When we launched out with our 15 people, one of the things that we did we did a citywide assessment. And it wasn't anything formal. I just went door to door. And I asked people just a few different questions. If you could see one thing happen in the city that would better the city, what would it be? If there's one thing that you'd like to see happen in the city, what would it be? And what is the one thing in the city that you wish would go away? And out of those two questions, we found it was incredibly enlightening. And as we went door to door within the neighborhood, and then we went to go to the businesses, then we went to city council, then we went to the city manager, then we went to the city mayor. The mayor's just a figurehead, the city that we're at. Really, the city manager is the one that runs the city. But we wanted to get as many data points as possible to figure out what was the makeup or the texture of our city. And what came out of that assessment was three things. Is that there was a need for the elderly, there was a need for the youth, and there's a need for the homeless. And so because of that, what we did was we can't do all three things. But so what we did was we focused on one and then two things. The first was homelessness, and the second was the children. And we poured all of our resources in reaching out to the homeless. So we started a food bank, and I still remember the first day that we did it. We were down in the basement, and we were quarantined off like a third of our sanctuary. And we brought in all this fresh produce. So you not only had to go through the side door of this church and then go down the stairs and then turn right, and you eventually found the fellowship hall. But as you were going down there, it just reeked of produce, like bananas and broccoli. It just smelled awful. So if anybody wanted to go to Wellspring, you really wanted to have to be there because nothing else was really appealing about it. But we just started handing out food. And then somebody who was on Section 8 housing within the community started coming, and she says, people are coming here for food, but why aren't we feeding them? So she had only like $5 or $10 to her name. She went to the King Soopers, which is the local grocery store, bought a packet of hot dogs, brought them back, cooked them up, and then we just handed out one hot dog at a time to each of them. We didn't have a bun, no ketchup, no mustard. We just handed out the hot dogs. And people sat down, and all of a sudden we began to see something remarkable happen. People were having fellowship. They were sharing stories with one another. And from that simple act, What happened was that we thought, this is phenomenal. So then every Sunday after that, we had a meal. So people would come in, we would sit together, we would have a meal, they would get food for the week and then go home. Up till that point, we did not see any life transformation when we were just handing out food. In fact, we became bitter because what we do is we'd hand out the food, we would go upstairs, and off to the side would be food that was just standing there, the food that they didn't want. We were getting frustrated within our own heart. We'd say to ourselves, don't these people know what we're trying to do for them? Instead of asking the question, what do they really need? And what we discovered was it was more than just food that they were homeless. It was more than just food that they were lacking. It was community, it was relationship, it was a community of love. And all of a sudden, when we began to sit with each other around a table, the table is a great equalizer, isn't it? I mean, isn't that the message of the gospel of the table? The table is the great equalizer. Because when we're sitting down at a table, and Mark has the salt and I have the pepper, and I'm eating something, and I want the salt, that puts me in a place of need, it puts Mark in a place of power, so he hands me the salt. But if I have pepper, and he wants pepper, it places me in a place of authority, it places him in a place of need, and there's give and take, there's sharing with one another. And it's eye to eye, face to face, conversation to conversation, story to story. And all of a sudden, in light of that, what we saw was that ministry of the well moved from transactional ministry to transformational ministry, and we began to see people come to know Jesus. I'm going to tell you one story. One guy by the name of Jerry Calb, he was a henchman, which meant that he was a drug dealer in our city, and he had a downline. So he would give drugs to people, and they would then distribute the drugs and then give him the money. Well, they weren't giving him the money. So he found out that the people were coming to the well where we feed, and so he was going to come to the well to collect, not to eat and enjoy community. So he came one Sunday to collect. And what he experienced when he came to Wellspring was the love of a community, the love that he had never experienced before. And he did not carry out what he intended to do. The next Sunday he came back to the well, but not to collect, but to experience love. Third Sunday, he came back. Not as a drug dealer, but as somebody who was interested and longing for love in the community. Fourth Sunday, fifth Sunday. And eventually he started coming to church. Then he came a second Sunday, a third Sunday, a fourth Sunday, and eventually, after about the fifth or sixth Sunday, he gave his life to Jesus. And then we baptized him, and unknown to him, he went to the Goodwill. He said, Billy, what kind of shirt do I wear? What kind of shirt should I wear? And I said, Jerry, I don't care what kind of shirt you wear, but it's got to be clean. I mean, it can't have any like profanity on it, please. So he went to the Goodwill, and he got a shirt, and unbeknownst to him, on it, it said, I am free. And we baptized him that Sunday on a shirt that said, I am free. And there was a shift that took place for us. It was transactional ministry growing into transformational ministry. And from that, there was all sorts of things that took place within not only Wellspring, but also the city. Because what that was a keynote strategy that really allowed us to kind of set the DNA for Wellspring to be a church on mission. And if you were to ask anybody for the first 10 years, what do you think of Wellspring? And they would say this: it's got unique worship, because they were coming from a non-liturgical background. They weren't sure about all this liturgy stuff. It's got unique worship, and we really appreciate their heart for the poor. And that's who we were. And that's who we still are today. So I would say, for where we're, especially in the early days, I was doing a lot of the evangelism. But now we're in a place as a church where my responsibility is not to actually do the work of evangelism, but to really set the vision and administrate for the work of evangelism. And that's why I say this. As a church plant, what we're called to do is to do mission or to do evangelism over administration until you get to the place of the church where you have to administrate in order to do evangelism. So that's the last principle. Now, before I'm going to jump into some Q&A, actually, before I get let's do this now before I jump into church planting and our church planting story. But any questions at this point? Any thoughts? Anything that stuck out? Anything that you want me to highlight? Yeah.
I'm a high advocate of accessibility, making, like you say, not dumbing down, but what we take for granted as Anglicans is really, really, really foreign to a Baptist that might stumble in the door, or a recovering Presbyterian or whatnot. kind of name some real practical steps that you use to help make the liturgy accessible.
Yeah. So it goes back to be the vision. I think if we're not inculcating the liturgy in our own life, it will not translate. If we don't see the message of the gospel just coming through the liturgy, and that message of the gospel transforming our own hearts, our people will know it. They'll know that we're just, if we're not allowing it to inform us, shape us, and it becomes, well, it could almost become Gnostic, where it's like, it's the liturgy's over here and I'm over here. But if we're allowed, so one of the things we do in the liturgy is a lot of the Kenyan liturgy, but at the end of the Eucharistic prayer, the Lamb who was slain has begun his reign. I mean, that's just powerful language. When we say sin, death, and hell has been conquered because of the work and the person of Jesus Christ, the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, and nothing can come against his kingdom, that we have victory in Jesus. The Lamb who was slain has begun his reign. Hallelujah. Hallelujah. And when we live that out and throughout our week, and when we see that in our own people where they're getting overcome by addictions, we're seeing the power of the King of Kings in their own life, and we are able to say together, the Lamb who is slain has begun his reign. Amen, Jesus is Lord. And then in a very real way, we say all of our problems, where do we send them? To the cross. All of our sins, where do we send them?
To the cross. All
the devil's works, we send to the cross of Christ. All of our hopes, we set on the risen Christ. And if we're not living in the gospel Monday through Sunday, that'll just be out here. So I think, live the liturgy.
For you troops out there, Bishop Ken is going to talk a little bit about their use of liturgy and seasonal use of liturgy. I want you to touch on that a little bit. But he's mentioned something that some of you might not be familiar with. Some of you have been around me long enough to know that I love what he calls the Kenyan liturgy. And I love it for a couple reasons. One, it's exceptionally joyful. So I love to use it during an Easter season. Second, it is highly participatory. So it works really well in a Mexican context where there's a lot of interplay back and forth. And it's coming out of that African culture.
Yeah.
And third, I like it because, once again, the language in it is very, very powerful. And so I know, for example, in Bill's church, St. Clement's, they use elements of the Kenyan liturgy, particularly the closing sending to the cross. But if you want, and I'm saying all this by way of, I'm happy to send you the Kenyan liturgy and let you see how you might be blessed by using that. I think it's a great, great liturgy. So go ahead.
The other thing that I think has been very helpful is as much as possible allowing the liturgy and what we do find its way into your sermon as application. So if you're talking about reconciliation, the passing of the peace is a great way to bring that in. So they don't just see it as just intermission, but they see it as an opportunity to really seek reconciliation. We have vertical reconciliation, now we can pursue horizontal reconciliation with one another. And by the way, this church is going to be marked off by holiness and health, which means there is no room for gossip, there's no room for slander, there's no room for backbiting and pleasantries. We're going to get to that. We're going to get to true, authentic community, which means that we are the body of Christ. We're just not an aggregation, we're a congregation. We're just not sewn together, we're grown together. And the language that Jesus uses about the body of Christ, the temple, where our lives are cemented in with one another. So gossip shouldn't be getting into those cracks and undermining the integrity of our community. So we can bring that into the passing of the peace, seeking reconciliation. So I guess finding ways to put it into the sermon. Yeah. Our people have really appreciated that. So, anything else? Any thoughts? Yes?
Hablaste de un equipo. ¿De cuántas gentes estamos hablando?
You talked about that team that you had to start off before you planted the church. How many people were part of that team?
Y, o sea, si este equipo, había personas que tuvieran características o dones especiales que ayudaron a la plantación de la iglesia.
And in that team, were there people with certain gifts and talents that helped with planting the church?
Yes, we had 15 people. and we had, they were radically different gifts. So this is so within church planting, I would suggest don't call a church plant your core team. Because with that kind of language, it communicates to them, we're going to always be the core team. So when the church grows and maybe less attention is given to them because we're growing as a community, sometimes they may feel ostracized. So I feel like communicating launch team and that we're utilizing our gift for a season so that we can have the opportunity to push reset after year 2, year 3, so they don't feel like we're a club of 4 and no more. We're always thinking about being inclusive instead of exclusive. Yeah?
When you had your launch team, did you all process-wise gather for like a year of prayer, Bible study together? And then like, what was your timing of it?
We went through the book of Acts for about 6 months. And as we were going through the book of Acts, we were just talking about like what would it be to be an Acts kind of community. And after the 6 months, we went to preview services for 4 months. So we would do 1 service a month. And that was really helpful because we knew that Sunday wasn't always coming. That we had 3 Sundays of a break, and then we can kind of gather ourselves and then do it again. It also allowed us the opportunity to say, though, that did not work. And framing expectations is super important. And if we say these are preview services, then people don't come with these expectations that now this is the worship service and that everything is going to be all figured out. And things are never figured out anyways, so. So it allows us to kind of manage people's expectations and kind of tweak things to where we felt, okay, we're good. We know what we're getting into. We've counted the cost, and we're ready to go Sunday to Sunday.
Did you run into any, I guess, backlash over your launch team feeling like this is the direction we should go, or did everyone really run everything through the vision that you all came up with? Like you said, the homeless thing was the first thing. Was that difficult to come to, this is where we're called, or did you guys have to really pray together to figure out, is this ahead of children's? How did you guys discern that process?
Yeah, we prayed like crazy. I think in planting a church, you pray like crazy. I mean, I'm going to talk a little bit about steps in this next section, a little bit about what we can do maybe as a diocese, some steps to think through. I would say, especially in the front end of things, it's probably better for the leader and the leaders to be more directive, and for the remainder of the people to understand. So there's a lot of communication, a lot of direction, not in a way that oversteps or is disrespectful, but is strong in direction, because especially in the early days, there's going to be a propensity for vision drift, for things to get off of what God has initially called us to do. So I think it's very important, especially in the early days, for the leader to be directive. And then kind of that next season, there's a greater opportunity for relationship with direction. And then the 3rd season, you're kind of letting off the gas pedal on direction and becoming more relational, and eventually you're just allowing them to do the work of the ministry. I mean that's just the process, but I think initially there has to be good justification. This is the direction we're going, and this is why. And that's why I did the assessment. I was the one that was going to the neighborhoods. I was the one that was primarily leading those things to kind of get a greater sense, and then I'd bring that to the team. Yeah, that's good. Yeah.
Where did people worship in the off Sundays when you're doing once a month or whatever? And did they come from different traditions, or did they come primarily from a planting church? Or?
So we incubated, the 15 people incubated at Christ Episcopal Church. Yeah, and out of that group of 15, there were 2 people who had grown up in the Episcopal Church. 2 people who had grown up in the Episcopal Church. Other people had come to Christ Church, but they had non-Episcopal backgrounds and were pretty recent. It was basically the 20s and 30s crew. Yeah.
What were some of the problems when you first started feeding the homeless that you had to deal with, and how did you deal with
Yeah.
Billy, could you repeat the question.
Yeah.
I can't hear what they're asking.
Yeah, that's so when the homeless started to come, how do we deal with some of the problems? Are you talking about for the feeding or to the Sunday services?
Well, both. I mean,
Yeah.
obviously, it was a work in progress, and you had to keep adjusting. I'm just wondering, because I think there's a hesitation sometime with the homeless that, will there be problems you won't know what to do or how to deal with them.
Yeah. Yeah, we had a lot of people leave. I shouldn't say a lot. Some people left because they felt unsafe. And if you were to come to their church today, it's not you wouldn't feel unsafe. You wouldn't say, "Oh, this is a church for the homeless." I mean, there's probably, I mean, even now, like on a Sunday of 450 or so, you might have like 30 or 35 of them. But that's even bad phrasing. But yeah, there's going to be problems during the service, and when that happens, I rejoice because it's a revelation of us living in the division that God has called us into. It's a great opportunity. I could tell you so many stories. One of my associate pastors, he was the first church that we planted. He tends to be a longer preacher than I am. He goes for about 40 or 50 minutes. And he was especially long on a Maundy, Thursday. It was a night service. And he says, "You guys, I know I'm going long. I'm about done. I know this is long." And one of the gals in the back said, "Yeah, you keep going on and on and on." We had a guy, his street name was Guitar Steve. This is during the Eucharist. He's dropping all sorts of F-bombs in the back. And in our congregation, we have a police officer, Officer Reed. And Officer Reed McGrath goes up to him and goes, "Steve, if you don't be quiet, I'm going to take you out," which didn't help the situation. He just got louder. So in the middle of our communion time, Officer Reed McGrath does a full takedown of Guitar Steve. And our ushers jump in, and you have one usher on one arm, another usher on another arm, Reed on a leg, another on a leg. And I was leading worship at the time, and you can see through the breezeway as Guitar Steve is getting carried out, and he's doing this during communion. So I don't know how you recover from that, but it communicates our vision, is what it does. I mean, we have homeless people come up, not all the time. There's been a few instances where they'll take the chalice and they'll just
Get more wine. More wine.
We need to refill. So I mean, there are situations like that. And not too long ago, one of our homeless friends, it was last winter, didn't sleep through the night because it's cold out. Comes to church, warm environment, comfortable chair. What does he do? Sleeps, front row. And he's a snorer during the sermon, and he's a loud snorer. And so we had to wake him up during the sermon. But yeah, there's a lot of those. It's great. Okay, let's keep moving.
One thing real quick I
Yeah.
wanted to ask you. I was sharing about a church being able to be balanced, to have worship, dynamic worship, which you've talked about, mission-driven, reaching the lost, which you've talked about. I'm less familiar with Wellspring, and I'd like to hear how you how do you build community within the folks that are there? How do you build a spirit of unity and fellowship? What do you do to establish that? And then also, what do you do for discipleship within the congregation?
Within connecting the well to the population, or just like community overall?
Having the well feel like the well. We're happy to be here. We love each other, and in other words, fellowship events that draw you together.
Yeah.
What do you do for that? And then discipleship. How do you handle that?
With the people in the well.
Or yeah,
overall.
with people in the well, but also obviously discipleship means reaching out to the community too.
People at the well, is the well the
Homeless ministry.
Homeless.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, that's a good clarifier. Yeah, I'm sorry.
And I thought Bishop was talking about people within the church.
Within the church.
Building community within the church.
How do you build community in the church, and how do you build discipleship for the people that are attending?
Okay. For the well or for the church?
Both.
Both. Okay, so that has been an issue. We're trying to figure that out, where it feels like we have downstairs people, which are the well, and the upstairs people, which are the people that come to church on Sunday. And to try to bridge that divide has been very difficult. One of the strategies that we do sermon-based life groups, and we have a liturgy to our life groups, and all the life groups, our small groups, are up, in, and out, the life of Jesus. So he's up, he was he acknowledged the Father in prayer. He was in with his people, with his disciples, and he also led a life without. So all of our life groups are up in and out. And they all have a liturgy that we all follow, and it's sermon-based. So we have a life group that's targeted for the well, where they're doing sermon-based life groups, and so that's an incentive for them to come to church on Sunday. Now that's a strategy, but that's not the most effective strategy. The most effective strategy is relationship and community. It's just for an initiation of saying, hey, let's go to lunch, let's go to coffee. Let me tell you, it's very difficult. I think one of the most difficult barriers to break is a socioeconomic barrier. Because I still remember my first conversation. I was talking to somebody who was homeless. I said, the first thought to my mind was, so where do you live? I can't ask that question, where do you live? What do you do? Where do we start? It's very difficult, but it's worth it. It's worth it. I know there's a question. I don't know if that answered it.
Sure.
Yeah.
And then building unity within the congregation.
Building unity within the congregation. We have a couple different platforms. Probably our connecting dinners are the most significant. Our connecting pastor has, every other week, she probably has 60 people coming over to her house. And we have life groups, but we also have connecting dinners. And that's one of the things, that's been a key strategy, where people just come and they eat, we have fellowship, and it's been a lot of fun. That's probably one of the biggest bright lights that we've, strategies that we've done the past couple of years. We have different platforms. We have the life group culture, the life group platform. We have the worship platform, and there's going to be community here. There's going to be community here. But the way that we try to bridge that is through the connecting dinners. I want to mention one thing in regards to our church planting history. Then I want to make a transition. Oh.
Well, what's a sermon-based life group?
So what will happen is I'll preach on Sunday,
Yeah.
and then I'll make 5 questions.
Yeah.
And then those are given to the life groups.
Okay.
And the life groups engage those 5 questions, which are based on the sermon.
Okay. And what's the difference between a connecting dinner and any other kind of potluck or something?
It's purely for connecting new people. Because for somebody to go into a life group who's
So
a
you
business,
invite some new people, or you just have some older members and then you invite other people, or what?
yes. And we tell people, if you've been to one connecting dinner, you're now a connector.
Yeah. Okay.
So we have, out of the 60, we'll have 20 people who are existed, they're wellspring.
Yeah.
So when those 40 people come that are new, or they may have been for 6 weeks, they don't know anybody, it's a soft entry point. It's a soft on-ramp into community. They will not step foot into a life group. I mean, that takes a lot of courage. That's a 1%er.
Okay.
So it's just a soft on-ramp for people to get plugged into community. If they're not plugged into community, they will eventually leave.
Yeah.
So there has to be ways of a pathway of getting them from. There's a lot of different on-ramps. You do have people coming in from life groups, but hardly ever. You have people coming in from Sunday morning, or we have people coming in from our leadership pipeline, like our internships, our apprenticeships, or residencies. We'll have people come through that, but it's mostly Sunday morning. So then the question becomes is then how do they get connected into the life of the community? That has to be really intentional and thoughtful. It's worth the thought. It's really important.
Question about your 5 questions that you write. Are they written and gone over before the sermon or after the sermon?
After.
And do you have any opinions about that, before or after?
About their answers?
Well, about when you'd ask those questions. Could you ask them in advance to prepare for the sermon, or do you find it more effective afterwards?
I prepare the sermon, and then right after I prepare the sermon, then I'll write those 5 questions, and then we'll disseminate them to the life groups leaders. So they'll have them. So some of them meet on Sunday night. So we give them to them, the life group leaders, on Thursday or Friday. I think is when she sends them out, and then she's already had them since Wednesday. So does that help?
Yeah. Have you ever tried it before the sermon?
I haven't.
Okay. Just a question, because I've been.
Yeah.
I tried it both ways.
That's a great thought. That's a great thought. All right. I have 20 minutes to get to the second section. Should I cut? Okay. All right, I want to mention just real quick, are there markers to that?
Yes.
I think there are over there.
Okay, so this has been our church planting experience. We planted in 2001, and we had this is not it. Okay, I'll use my hands. Maybe over here. Okay, so when we planted in 2001, we started with, 15 people, and we had a vision for planting churches in what's called the donut. Now, I don't know if you have this in other cities where you're at, but so what we said is where we're going to target is in the neighborhood right outside of the inner city. So you have the inner city of Denver, and then you have the new suburbs. So you have right here and then out here. And what we were targeting was the donut part. And the reason why that was significant is because, at least in Denver, in the old suburbs, one of two things happen to churches. Either they get hot, double, triple in attendance, they sell their facility, and then where do they move? They move to the suburbs. That's a dynamic that's happening all over the place. They don't stay there. Or they just die. But regardless, it leaves a spiritual vacuum within this old neighborhood, the old neighborhoods around the city. And so what our vision is to plant multiple churches around that donut. So if you think about like a sprinkled donut, that's kind of the vision of what we want to do. So in 2010, we planted our first church, which was Advent. We used the Hive model where Rob Harris, who was my associate, raised up over the course of about a year and a half 50 people, and we launched him into an area which is the neighborhood just south of downtown Denver called the Baker neighborhood. Now the lesson that we learned about that plant was it was too independent. We launched those guys out, and it was like it never happened. And we ceased with communication. And we came back like 6 months later. Rob and I weren't in very much communication. We didn't learn what they were learning, and they weren't in communication with us, and it was like they were a completely independent entity. Even though they were part of the Anglican Church, they were under Bishop Ken's leadership, absolutely. But in regards to our relationship, it was too independent. And so that was one of the lessons that we learned, is that we didn't want to do that again. The other lesson that we learned is especially in the first church plant, if you're thinking about planting a church, keep this in mind, is that if it's your first church plant, you have to spend a lot more time on the front end with the first one, casting vision of why we're planting a church. Because what we found is we had to have continued conversation about why we're doing it. Because some people thought this was a euphemism for a church split. And we said, no, this is a church plant. Rob and I love each other. We don't want to do this in our flesh, but we feel like it's a kingdom thing. And it took a year and a half for us to be able to communicate that. For them to feel like, okay, we get it. Okay? Second church that we planted, Wellspring Littleton, 2015. Again, a Hive model. Tim, who was associate, he gathered up 120 people and planted. And one of the things from Wellspring Inglewood, we sent out 120 people. And by the way, out of our 5 top biggest givers, he took 3 of them. 2015, we were $60,000 in the red. And it was also during a season, and Ken can testify, it was the most difficult season in the ministry that I've ever had to go through. I almost quit. I almost got out of the ministry altogether. And if it wasn't for Ken and his leadership and his encouragement and prayer, I probably would have gotten out. All the more reason we need to have an Episcopal system. Bishops are good. Tim came up to me and he said, Billy, do you want me to postpone this plant? And I said, Tim, you're the only light on in this place. And we're not going to let the devil rob us of the opportunity to fulfill the vision that he's given us. We're not going to chicken out. And so we planted the church. The one thing that we learned about that was we tried to keep it too close. We tried to keep the same back office, same everything. And as a result, we feel like it led to, it wasn't allowing him to be as dynamic as he needed to be. And so, so now we're just kind of unraveling that, but that was the lesson that we learned with Wellspring Littleton. The next church plant, Rizal, which is the one that we're planting this year and will lead into next year, is we feel like it's a healthy balance of interdependence, where there's a connection. And so we built this Wellspring network where we have things that we're connected with. We do things together where it feels like we're togetherness. He'll come to Wellspring Inglewood and share testimony. And so we have predictable patterns that we engage in to allow for the people to see that the church that he's planting, Rhizo, is a part of us, and yet it's a completely separate entity, self-generating, self-replicating, self-governing, self-sustaining, still under Ken, but all of those things. And as a result, it's created a great tension. So,
Billy?
yeah.
Real quick, it's so counterintuitive, but I think the people here need to hear it. You're entering into a horrible time of ministry. You're siphoning off 3 of the best givers of the church. You're $60,000 in the red.
And we're giving away the best preacher in the church.
And you're giving away the best preacher in the church. In a worldly level, you're saying, you're nuts, okay? This is absolute, total insanity. What did God do? How did God backfill what you had given him?
So when we planted Advent, the next Sunday we were 100% replenished, and even more so. With Littleton, it took us an entire year, but because of other circumstances. But this year, we closed out our fiscal year August 30th, we ended up $160,000 in the black.
Would you attribute that to being faithful to the Great Commission?
Yes.
Would you attribute that to, what do you attribute that to?
Yeah, being faithful to the Great Commission. God gave us a vision, and I feel like there was a lot of prayer. I don't want to get into that just right now, but we had to get to the point where we sang, is Jesus the Lord of the church, and are we just ambassadors of the church, or is this something that I got to hold on to? And ultimately we said this, Jesus is King of Kings, he's Lord of Lords, he's the Lord of the church. All things are under his feet for the church. Whether this thing makes it or not, whether Wellspring Inglewood makes it or not, that's not for me to say. But he's given us a vision, he's given us a calling, and we're going to stay true to it thick or thin. Even if it takes Wellspring Inglewood under for the flourishing of Wellspring Littleton, so be it. So be it. So, yeah, it really did feel like, Romans chapter 12, a living sacrifice. I felt like a living sacrifice. Okay. Inheriting the land. How can maybe you as a diocese, these are just some thoughts, some practical next steps for engaging church planting as a diocese. The first thing is I'm going to start with prayer. Be a praying diocese. Now that can be expressed in a lot of different ways. That can be expressed within your individual congregations during the prayers of the people. It can be a mandate or commission from the bishop, whatever it is. It is so critical because I believe that without prayer, we would have never done what you just talked about. Let me ask you a question. How many people know this name? Shemua. If you know, honestly, if you know that name from the Bible, raise your hand. Okay. Shaphat. Okay, no one. Igal. Okay. Palti. Any Palti fans? No. No. Nehemiah? Okay, we'll see. Yeah. Gadiel. Any Gadiel followers? No. Amiel. Sethur. Nabai. No Nabai fans? Come on, Nabai. Last one. I don't know how to pronounce this. Geuel? Geuel. No. Okay, next question. How many people have ever heard of the name in the Bible, Caleb? Raise your hand. Okay, most people. Joshua. Anybody heard of Joshua? Okay, most people. Those previous 10 were the 10 spies that didn't believe in God. The 10 spies were the ones that didn't trust in the promises of God. Who are the 2 names that we know today? Caleb and Joshua. Now why? Why is that? I'll tell you why. And it comes from Exodus chapter 33. This is why. Now Moses used to take a tent and pitch it outside the camp, some distance away, calling it the tent of meeting. Anyone inquiring of the Lord would go to the tent of meeting outside the camp. And whenever Moses went into the tent, all the people rose and stood at the entrance to their tents, watching Moses until he entered the tent. As Moses went into the tent, the pillar of cloud would come down and stay at the entrance, while the Lord spoke with Moses. Whenever the people saw the pillar of cloud standing at the entrance to the tent, they all stood and worshipped, each at the entrance to their tent. The Lord would speak to Moses face to face, as one speaks to a friend. Then Moses would return to the camp, but his young aide, Joshua, son of Nun, did not leave the tent. He stayed in the tent. He was a worshiper. He was a prayer. Remember what Moses said? God, if you don't go in, we're not going in. We don't want your promises without your presence. And what prayer does is says, Lord, I want your presence. Because if you don't go before us, this isn't going to work. So I can't overestimate enough the power of prayer, the emphasis of prayer. If you want to start a church planting movement, if you want to see church planting rise up, if you want to have a conviction of church planting within this diocese, if there's a culture of church planting with this, it begins with prayer. Everybody praying and saying, Lord, help us. And I think there's three things that we can be praying about. First is that we pray for leaders to be raised up. Pray for the Lord of the harvest to provide workers for the vineyard. We need leaders. We need leaders who will come and plant churches. It is true that there's the 1%ers. 1%ers, they don't need to go to church planting boot camp. They don't need to have church planting coaching. Church planting is just intuitive. Reality is 99.9% of the people are not the 1%ers. I would say there's about 10 to 15% of the priests in any diocese are equipped and gifted to plant churches. We need to pray for that 10 to 15% for leaders to come in our diocese and plant churches. So pray for leaders. The second is to pray for leaders to be holy leaders who are consecrated. In fact, it says in Joshua, going to Joshua chapter 3, it seems like an editorial comment, but it's extremely important. Joshua told the people, consecrate yourselves, for tomorrow the Lord will do amazing things among you. And it's amazing, like you go through Deuteronomy, what is the one thing that God gives his people as they go into the Holy Land? He gives them holiness. He gives them holiness. He doesn't give them armor. He doesn't give them swords. He doesn't give them chariots or horses. He gives them holiness. So we need to pray for leaders, but we need to pray for holy leaders. The number one thing, and this comes out of Lifeway, the number one reason why church plants fail is not because they don't have great strategy. It's not because they don't have great vision. It's not because they don't have a great core team or launch team or whatever you want to call them. It's not because they don't have great training at boot camps. It's not because they don't have great coaching. The number one reason why church plants fail is because church planters fail. Number one reason. We need to be praying for leaders. We need to be praying for holy leaders. It's serious. It's serious. Third, we need to pray for bold faith for all of us. Everybody involved. We need boldness. We need to step out. We need to be bold. And that comes from Joshua chapter 3, verse 9 through 13. It says, Joshua said to the Israelites, come here and listen to the words of the Lord your God. This is how you will know that the living God is among you, and that he will certainly drive out before you the Canaanites, the Hittites, Hivites, Perizzites, Girgashites, Amorites, Jebusites. See, the ark of the covenant of the Lord of all the earth will go into the Jordan ahead of you. Now then, choose 12 men from the tribes of Israel, one from each tribe. And, now listen, this is important. Verse 13, and as soon as the priests who carry the ark of the Lord of all the earth, set foot in the Jordan, as soon as they set foot in the Jordan, the waters flowing downstream will be cut off and stand up in a heap. Verse 14, now when the people broke camp to cross the Jordan, the priests carrying the ark of the covenant went ahead of them. Notice verse 15. Now the Jordan is at flood stage all during harvest. Why is that editorial comment there? Why the Jordan? Because in the ancient Near East, people attribute gods to bodies of water. The Ganges in India, the Nile in Egypt. Why? Because from the water comes life. To drink water, you get life from the water. Crops, they need water. Life comes from the water. So in the ancient Near East, you would attribute gods to the water. What's going on here? Joshua, they're entering into the river with the ark. And notice it doesn't stand up before they step in. It stands up as they step in, or when they step in. And it's at flood stage. In other words, people in the ancient Near East would have known this, that this is when the gods were the most powerful, most glorious. This is when the pagan gods were at their best. And yet when the God of Israel comes through, when the ark comes through, the gods bow. They're defeated. They stop at the presence of this God, the one true God, the holy God. And as they step in, the waters stop. Now that took incredible amounts of courage to step into the water. Incredible amounts of courage. We need to pray for courage. We need to pray for the alleviation of fear, and we need to pray for the boldness of faith. Bold faith. It's interesting to me, I think it's the first prayer in the early church, in the book of Acts. It's right after what? John and Peter get arrested, they get flogged, they get beat. They're not sure if they're going to make it out of the prison. They get out for some miraculous reason. I mean, this is after they've been persecuted, they've been beat, they've been told not to say anything. They go back to the other disciples and they praise God because they were counted worthy to suffer for the name. And then what do they pray? What's their prayer? Lord, stretch out your hand and give us boldness. I'm thinking to myself, you're bold. You're already bold. And yet that's exactly what they pray for. In order to engage in church planting as a diocese, as a congregation, we need boldness. And just as people make disciples and programs facilitate relationships for disciples to take place, churches plant churches and dioceses support the churches. Let me say that again. Only people can make disciples. Programs don't make disciples. People make disciples. But programs facilitate for people to engage people that allows the discipleship process to happen. Likewise, churches plant churches. Dioceses don't plant churches. Churches plant churches, and dioceses support and facilitate, which allow the church plants to be planted. And we all, this is all hands on deck, a reply all, an all skate. We're all called to pray for boldness. Boldness. Okay. I want to keep moving because that's only point one. I got four more. I'm going to bring this together here. The second thing, okay, first one, pray. Pray for leaders, pray for holy leaders, and pray for boldness. Second, develop a team. There's no such thing as a lone ranger, and that's found in verse 3, chapter 3, verse 12. Now then, choose 12 men from the tribes of Israel, one from each tribe. They did not go it alone. And this goes back to the importance of a launch team. Jesus had his 12. He also had his 3. He also had his 1. But he had his 12. You see Paul, the greatest evangelist that we know, wrote 3/4 of the New Testament. Who did Paul have? He had a number of people. He had Silas. He had Apollos later on in Acts. He had Timothy. Timothy came. He obviously had Barnabas, and then Barnabas had Mark. They were always going out in twos. And if Paul saw fit to go out in twos, I think it's important for us to be able to consider, okay, since we're not Paul, it's important. This is a team thing. Exodus 18, Moses. Jethro says, you can't do this alone. You need help. So as a church plant, we need teams. Going back to what I said before, the number one reason why I feel like Wellspring made it is because of a launch team. In the midst of all my faults, all my foibles, all my screw-ups, I had a launch team that says, you know what, we're going to do this together, and we're with you through the thick and thin. You need a launch team. I was talking to somebody today, or actually this past week, who I was coaching, and he's longing right now as he's in the process of planting a church, somebody who is a co-laborer with him. And we're just trying to figure out strategies to bring somebody along with him, because it's just a need. It's a need. So, develop a team, a task force. And now that can happen in a number of different ways. If there's 2 or 3 churches that want to come together and plant a church, there's a lot of different ways that you could do this. Maybe we could talk about that later. But develop a team. Third is identify where you're currently at and be brutally honest with where we're at as a diocese. And that probably starts with the team. So you develop a team maybe from the diocese where you have like 4 or 5 people that really are passionate about this, and we take an honest evaluation. Where are we at as a diocese in regards to planting churches? Do we have strategic oversight for planting churches? Do we have a leadership pipeline for planting churches? Do we have an assessment structure for planting churches? Do we have training? Do we have coaching? Do we have funding? Do we have ongoing support? And be brutally honest. And if we get to the point where we say, we have none of that, praise Jesus. Because the first step of taking the next step is acknowledging exactly where we're at and say, okay, what is the next step in light of this? So that leads to my next point. Identify the next step. Identify where you're at, and then identify what the next step is. So as you have a team, it says, okay, this is where we're at. We don't have any leaders in the pipeline. So maybe that becomes our rallying cry. Is we need to identify for our diocese one person in our diocese that will plant a church. Great. That's a rallying cry. That's something that you can get behind. That's a defining objective. You can say, well, we want to plant one person in 2018. And then we just begin to identify some strategies that you can engage in. Some money that needs to be raised, some assessment that needs to be done. And that's where there can be a partnership within the diocese. If there's an identification of a church planter, We have some of those constructs where we could come in and we could do an assessment with some people who are also passionate about this. We could do it together, and in the process also train other assessors. Same thing with coaching, same thing with training. So there's freedom in the fact to say, we don't have any or all of these constructs, but let's be brutally honest with where we're at, and then secondly, what are our next steps? What are our strategic next steps that we need to take to begin to develop a culture of church planting? So, those are my 4 things, and I have one last thing. So pray, develop a team, identify where you're currently at, identify next steps, and lastly, when you see success, celebrate the daylights out of it. And this is what I mean. Chapter 4, verse 4. So Joshua called together the 12 men who had appointed from the Israelites, one from each tribe, and said to them, "Go over before the ark of the Lord your God into the middle of the Jordan. Each of you is to take up a stone on his shoulder, and according to the number of the tribes of the Israelites, to serve as a sign among you in the future. When your children ask you, 'What do these stones mean?' tell them that the flow of the Jordan was cut off before the ark of the covenant of the Lord. When it crossed the Jordan, the waters of the Jordan were cut off. These stones are to be a memorial to the people of Israel forever." We are so prone to forget the good things that God has done. And biblically speaking, as soon as we forget, we've stepped into sin. We are always to remember. Do this in remembrance of me. So I would say this, anytime you have a win, celebrate it. One of my mentors said this, the power of vision is not on the front side, it's on the back side. A pastor could get up there all day and say this, we are going to take this hill, or we're going to raise $15,000 for this initiative. And then after that initiative has been done and say nothing about it, that has been counterproductive. There's so much more power. Instead of saying this is what we're going to do, there's so much more power in saying this is what we've done. And when we have time to celebrate the goodness of God, the faithfulness of His people, man, there is nothing more inspiring. There will be nothing more that encourages a community and a culture for church planting than celebrate the small wins as you see that progression in becoming a church planting diocese. I think it's good. So the last thing I want to leave you with is this. So, pray, develop a team, identify where you're at, identify next steps, and lastly, celebrate them. Just celebrate the small wins. That's step 5. And the last thing I want to leave you with, and it's been an illustration that has probably been the most forming and impactful for me over the past 10 years. And it's an illustration by Ray Anderson. Does anybody know the name Ray Anderson? He was a professor at Fuller. Yeah, Fuller. And he has a little book called Unspoken Wisdom. And basically what it is, it's a book of lessons that he learned from his father. His father never got past like a 3rd grade education, but he was a brilliant man. If you know anything about Ray Anderson, he was brilliant. And so if his dad was anything like Ray, I mean, he was an incredibly intellectual man. And he was a farmer. And so Ray, throughout his life, saw all these just incredibly wise things that his dad would do and wise things that his dad would say. And he basically put them in a book. And he recalls back to a time when he was just a young boy, and he went out with his dad farming. And it was a harvest year where it was just a bumper crop. He'd never seen a harvest like this before. He recalls going out on a Friday and seeing the harvest, and seeing the crop, and looking forward to tomorrow when they were going to begin to harvest, and just being filled with excitement. That night, Friday night, going into Saturday, where they lived experienced a hailstorm. It completely destroyed everything. Everything was gone. And Ray tells the story, goes on by saying that he went out with his father the next day to look at the damage. Everything was destroyed. Everything gone. And he asked his dad, what do we do? He said, son, we're going to plow it under, and we're going to prepare for next year's harvest. And the word of wisdom that Ray took away from that is this, is that we never put our trust in the harvest. We only put our trust in the seed. We do not put our trust in the outcome of church planting. We put our trust in the gospel of Jesus Christ. And as we trust in Him and lean into Him and walk with Him, I believe what we will see as fruit will be church planting. But we don't put our trust in church planting. That's idolatry. We put our trust in Jesus. So for me, that was incredibly freeing. Because I thought, I'm not the one that needs to make this thing go. I just need to continue to trust and lean into Christ. So.
Yeah.